From the outside, our relationship looked enviable. People saw laughter, weekend trips, and carefully curated photos of brunches that suggested harmony. But beneath that thin layer of perfection, something had been quietly rotting. My girlfriend, Emma, had a way of making me feel both loved and sidelined at the same time. Her affection came with conditions, her warmth always orbiting someone else's approval. That someone was her best friend, Daniel. Daniel had been part of Emma's life long before I came into the picture. Their friendship was a centerpiece of her identity, the kind that carried an unspoken hierarchy where I was always the newcomer, the extra chair at a table already full. When I met him for the first time, he greeted me with a familiarity that bordered on condescension, as if he were granting me permission to date her rather than acknowledging me as her partner. His presence seeped into every corner of our relationship, from movie choices to home decor, even to how I dressed. Emma often compared me to him in small, disarming ways that were easy to dismiss until they piled into something unbearable. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that long friendships deserve respect, that I shouldn't be threatened by history. But history has weight, and when it's constantly dropped on your chest, it starts to crush. Emma's world revolved around Daniel's validation. Every decision, every thought, every small success needed a stamp of approval. When she landed a promotion at work, he was the first person she called. When we had arguments, he was her confidant and advisor. It was like living in a triangle where one side was always stronger than the others. I didn't mind their friendship until it began bleeding into boundaries. Daniel had a key to our apartment, a privilege Emma insisted on for emergencies. Those emergencies ranged from borrowing a charger to surprising her with coffee. I'd come home to find him comfortably lounging on our couch, shoes off, as if he owned the place. Emma would light up every time he arrived, her tone shifting into something lighter, brighter, reserved exclusively for him. When I expressed discomfort, I was labeled insecure. She told me that trust meant accepting all parts of her life, including him. But trust doesn't mean being trampled. It means balance, and we had none. The tipping point came quietly. It wasn't a fight or a dramatic discovery. It was fatigue, a slow erosion of peace that left me hollow. I started noticing how Emma's affection toward me waned in proportion to Daniel's praise. If he complimented something I did, she followed. If he criticized me, she mirrored it. I became a reflection of his opinion rather than my own person. In subtle ways, I was being reshaped, molded by an invisible hand that had no right to touch my life. Still, I endured it, convincing myself that things would normalize. I told myself that love could coexist with discomfort, that patience would eventually earn respect. But patience without boundaries turns into submission, and that's exactly what I'd become. Someone bending just to keep the peace. The irony was that Emma often spoke about loyalty. She valued honesty and emotional transparency, yet her loyalty wasn't a truth or fairness. It was to Daniel. He occupied the moral high ground in her mind, no matter what he did. His jokes at my expense were dismissed as harmless. His constant intrusions were excused as quirks. I began to feel like an uninvited guest in my own relationship, tiptoeing around their dynamic just to avoid being painted as a problem. Then came the day everything shifted. Daniel revealed something to me. Something he should never have said, something that turned every polite smile I'd given him into quiet rage. It was the kind of confession that leaves a mark on your conscience. He spoke of betrayal as if it were a joke, of secrecy as if it were a privilege. And I became the unwilling keeper of that secret, trapped between my morals and my silence. That night, when I looked at Emma, I saw a woman blinded by loyalty to someone who didn't deserve it. I wanted to tell her everything, to shatter her illusions, but I didn't. I let the secret sit inside me like a coiled snake, waiting. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be told immediately. Sometimes it needs the perfect moment to strike. And that moment would come, not through confrontation or anger, but through calm calculation. I didn't know it yet, but the stage for it had already been set. Every slight, every dismissal, every blind offense of Daniel's behavior was a thread weaving toward the inevitable unraveling. In relationships, there's a quiet, threshold where love turns into endurance, and endurance turns into resentment. I had crossed that line long ago. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was simply waiting for the right moment to restore my dignity, even if it meant losing everything else in the process. Because love built on imbalance can only survive until one person remembers their worth. And that memory was slowly, mercilessly coming back to me. Secrets have a strange gravity. They don't just sit quietly inside you. They pull, twist, and reshape the space around your thoughts. Ever since Daniel's confession, my mind had become a place where resentment and restraint fought for dominance. He had spoken so casually that night, his words laced with the kind of arrogance only a man certain of impunity can possess. What he revealed wasn't just a passing indiscretion. It was a calculated betrayal. And in that moment, he turned me into his unwilling accomplice. For weeks after that night, I carried a secret like a toxin. I didn't ask for it, didn't deserve it, yet it began to shape the way I saw both him and Emma. Every time she defended him, every time she brushed off his behavior as just Daniel being Daniel, the poison stirred. I couldn't unhear his words, couldn't forget the ease with which he discarded his vows, his wife's trust, and basic decency. What unsettled me even more was how normal he made it sound. As if infidelity was a harmless vice, an indulgence he'd earned through charm and wit. I began to notice the cracks in Emma's perception of him, though she refused to acknowledge them. Daniel was her mirror, and to question him was to question herself. He represented everything she admired: confidence, cleverness, an illusion of emotional depth. But to me, he was a man who had built his personality on manipulation, a performer whose applause came from deceiving those who trusted him most. There were days when I almost told her. The words would rise to my throat, heavy and sharp, but I'd swallow them again. The timing never felt right. The world around us moved with unsettling normalcy. Dinners, workdays, quiet mornings. Yet beneath that rhythm, the truth pulsed like a heartbeat I couldn't silence. It wasn't just about what Daniel had done. It was about what it revealed about Emma's loyalty. Would she even believe me if I told her? Or would she twist it into another example of my supposed insecurity? I started keeping a mental ledger of all the things I had tolerated: the dismissive tone, the emotional sidelining, the constant intrusion. And now, on top of that, the burden of protecting the man who caused it all. It was a slow kind of suffocation. There's something profoundly lonely about knowing a truth that could destroy lives, yet being forced to live among those who remain oblivious to it. Emma's affection had become conditional, dictated by Daniel's opinion. If he praised me, she softened. If he criticized, she withdrew. I was living in an emotional economy controlled entirely by him, and that realization was a final insult. Love had become performance where I no longer had a role, just a script written by someone else. The breaking point came not through some dramatic confrontation, but through accumulation, the endless cycle of belittlement and blind defense. It was a Saturday morning when Daniel let himself into our apartment again, unannounced, his key jingling like a reminder of my powerlessness. I remember standing there, feeling the air leave the room, and realizing that every ounce of patience I'd once had was gone. That day, I asked Emma for something simple, for him to at least announce himself before entering. It was a small boundary, reasonable, even polite, but in her mind it was an act of war. By setting a boundary with Daniel, I had insulted her faith in him. Her reaction wasn't disappointment. It was outrage, as if I had broken some sacred pact. And in that explosion, I understood everything I needed to know about where I stood. Emma's loyalty was not to truth, not to fairness, but to her own version of harmony, one where Daniel could do no wrong, and I could never be right. It wasn't love anymore. It was obedience dressed as understanding. I had been patient, quiet, and measured, but my silence had been mistaken for weakness. That evening, the tension in our home felt like static before storm. I knew what was coming. The accusation, the guilt-tripping, the emotional theater designed to make me apologize for asking for respect. And when it arrived, it was as predictable as it was absurd. Emma framed my boundary as cruelty, insisting that I had humiliated Daniel, made him feel unwelcome. She demanded I fix it, that I make things right. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I looked at her, The woman I had loved, the partner I had defended, the person who had made me question my own worth, and felt nothing but quiet certainty. I realized that she didn't want peace, she wanted control. She didn't want fairness, she wanted validation. And that's when the idea took root. For months, I had carried Daniel's secret like a burden. But suddenly it felt less like a weight and more like a weapon, not of revenge, but a truth. It wasn't about humiliation or spectacle. It was about balance. If they wanted a performance, I would give them one, but it would be my performance, not theirs. The secret that once caged me was now the key. I just needed the right stage, the right audience, and the perfect moment to deliver my truth. And as fate would have it, they would hand me all three. When truth lingers too long in the dark, it begins to rot. It starts to eat away at your peace, at your sense of right and wrong, until you no longer recognize who you are. That's what those weeks did to me. Every morning felt heavier, every evening quieter, as if the walls of my own home were judging me for staying silent. The burden of Daniel's secret wasn't just emotional anymore. It had become physical. I could feel it in my chest, in the tension that never left my jaw, in the way my reflection seemed like someone else's. The moment I began to undo everything came disguised as something harmless. Emma's birthday dinner. She wanted something intimate, just family, which meant, of course, Daniel would be there. She said it with a smile that carried an unspoken expectation, as if she was daring me to object. I didn't, not because I agreed, but because I knew it would be the perfect stage. The night arrived dressed in artificial warmth. The table was decorated with candles, the kind of soft light that tries to convince you everything is fine. Emma looked radiant, not because of joy, but because of the attention she was about to receive. Daniel arrived with his usual confidence, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and a grin that could fool anyone but me. I remember thinking how easily people like him move through the world, leaving chaos behind them, yet always being welcomed as guests of honor. The dinner began with laughter, stories, and a thin layer of civility that everyone seemed eager to maintain. I played along, my silence deliberate. I watched him charm the table, spinning tales about business, travel, and opportunity. Every word felt like an echo of his deception, every gesture a reminder of what he confessed. And Emma, as always, was hypnotized by it. But beneath that performance, I was calm, too calm. It was a kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from decision. I had spent too long protecting their comfort, too long preserving an illusion that only served their egos. That night wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about release. As the evening went on, the wine flowed and the tone of conversation loosened. Daniel began to talk about loyalty, how relationships were built on trust, and how honesty was the foundation of every successful bond. He said it with the smug confidence of someone who believed his lies had become truth. Emma nodded, smiling, as if he were dispensing wisdom. And that's when something inside me snapped. I didn't speak. I didn't make a scene. I simply looked at him long enough for the silence to stretch uncomfortably. The kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats because they can feel the truth hiding behind it. Daniel noticed, of course, but he mistook it for resentment. He laughed it off, told another story, but the seed was already planted. The atmosphere shifted, slightly, subtly, but enough for everyone to sense it. After dessert, when Emma excused herself to grab something from the kitchen, Daniel leaned in and whispered, "You've been quiet all night. Still upset about the key thing?" His tone was mocking, careless. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder of his power, of his untouchable place in Emma's world. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up and began clearing the plates. When Emma returned, I smiled, the first genuine smile in months, because I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to argue, accuse, or expose him out of anger. I would let the truth come to light in its own perfect way. Over the next few days, I began to plan, not meticulously, but instinctively. I knew Daniel's patterns, his arrogance, his need to boast. He wasn't content with deceit. He needed acknowledgement, admiration for his cunning. So I gave him that. I became friendly again, approachable, as if I had finally accepted his charm. I laughed at his jokes, listen to his stories, and even join conversations I would have avoided before. To him, it must have felt like victory. The more comfortable he grew, the looser his tongue became, and predictably, his arrogance became his undoing. During one of his visits, unannounced as always, he started bragging about a friend who had managed to balance two relationships without either woman finding out. He described it with that same sly grin, and though he never used names, the details were too familiar. Emma didn't catch on, she never did, but I knew exactly who the story was about. That's when I decided that his own words would destroy him, not mine. A few days later, I suggested we host another small gathering, something casual with mutual friends and colleagues. Emma loved the idea, always eager for social affirmation. Daniel, of course, agreed. His ego couldn't resist another spotlight. The plan was simple. Let him speak. Let him be himself. People like Daniel can't help but reveal who they truly are when they believe no one will hold them accountable. The night of the gathering, everything unfolded naturally. The laughter, the stories, the drinks, all following the same pattern as before. Only this time, I wasn't anxious. I was watching the unraveling begin. When Daniel started boasting again, weaving another story about deception and control, the room fell into that same uneasy silence I had cultivated before. But this time there were witnesses. Emma's expression faltered. Confusion replaced admiration, and doubt flickered in her eyes for the first time. She didn't say anything, but her smile froze, her breathing changed, and I knew the truth had finally found its way into her mind. She excused herself not long after, retreating into the kitchen. Daniel, oblivious, kept talking, as if the more words he spoke, the more untouchable he became. I followed her quietly. She stood by the counter, gripping the edge, her face pale. I didn't have to say a word. The truth was already in the air between us, undeniable, irreversible. The same truth I had carried for months had finally reached its destination, not through confrontation, but through exposure. That night marked the beginning of the end. Not just of their illusion, but of everything that had held me captive. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the outsider in my own life. The storm hadn't hit yet, but I could feel it coming. And for once, I was ready to let it. There's a strange kind of calm that follows the collapse of everything you once believed in. It doesn't come with relief or triumph. It's heavier than silence and sharper than grief. That's what the days after the gathering felt like. Not explosive, not chaotic, just quiet. The kind of quiet that means something fundamental has shifted and will never return to the way it was. Emma didn't call for 3 days. No texts, no questions, no explanations. For someone who had always been so loud, so sure of herself, her silence was deafening. I knew she was unraveling, finally seeing what I had seen all along. When she did show up, she didn't come inside right away. She stood by the gate, her face hollow, the confidence that once defined her replaced by a quiet kind of devastation. She didn't need me to say, "I told you so." The truth was already written all over her face. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Daniel, in his usual arrogance, tried to manipulate the narrative, claiming that everything was exaggerated, that people misunderstood his jokes, that he was simply being entertaining. But his performance no longer worked. The charm had worn off, the illusion shattered. Those who once admired him started keeping their distance. The whispers grew louder, and soon, even the people who used to defend him began to see the pattern of deceit he left behind. As for Emma, she tried to hold it together, but cracks formed faster than she could hide them. The relationship that she had so proudly built on appearances had been hollow all along, and now the emptiness was staring her in the face. I watched from a distance, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. There are some lessons people can only learn through pain, and she had finally met hers. The last time I saw Daniel, he came to the restaurant, not as a customer, not even as an apology, but as a man who had lost control of the narrative. He stood by the counter, eyes darting, voice quieter than I'd ever heard. He tried to justify himself, saying he never meant for things to go this far, that he was just trying to impress people. It was almost pathetic, but I didn't respond. I didn't argue, because what he wanted wasn't forgiveness. It was validation, another chance to feel important. So I gave him nothing. When he realized I wasn't going to engage, he left. No grand ending, no confrontation, just a quiet sound of the door closing behind him. And with that, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for months finally began to lift. Emma stopped coming around soon after. Maybe out of shame, maybe because she needed to rebuild herself without the reminders of what she ignored for so long. Either way, I let her go. The version of our relationship that once existed couldn't survive what had happened. In truth, it probably shouldn't have. The weeks turned into months, and for the first time in years, I began to rediscover the stillness I'd been missing. The restaurant started to feel alive again. Laughter returned, new customers came in, and my staff seemed lighter, freer. The shadow that had lingered around us was gone. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was gradual and quiet, like healing often is. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about how easily people like Daniel manipulate kindness, how they twist decency into weakness, and how long it takes for those around them to realize it. But those thoughts didn't consume me anymore. They became reminders instead, lessons carved by pain but preserved by growth. There's something deeply liberating about reaching a point where you no longer need revenge or closure. When the truth stands on its own, you don't have to hold it up anymore. It speaks for itself. A few months later, I heard that Daniel had moved to another city. Apparently, his reputation had followed him, and no one wanted to hire him. His charm had finally outlived its usefulness. Emma, on the other hand, started therapy, something I never imagined she'd do. She reached out once, a short message. "I finally understand. I'm sorry." I never replied. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. The story didn't end with reconciliation or redemption. It ended with distance, the kind that feels necessary, not cruel, the kind that makes space for new beginnings. In the end, the lesson wasn't about betrayal or revenge. It was about silence, how powerful it can be when used not as surrender, but as strength. I didn't expose Daniel through rage or confrontation. I simply stepped back and allowed the truth to do what it always does: surface, unravel, and destroy everything built on lies. And as for me, I finally learned that peace doesn't come from fixing what's broken. It comes from walking away from what refuses to heal.